Hello, my name is Graham Williams, and I feel very humbled to be speaking to an audience from a country that has produced such literary and story giants as Dostoevsky, Gorky, Afanasiev. My pronunciation isn't quite as Russian as it should be. Vladimir Nabokov, Solzhenitsyn, Mikhail Bulgakov, and Tolstoy. So Tolstoy loved the story about his old nanny. She would lie alone listening to the clock ticking on the wall, and the clock asked, "Who are you? What are you? Thought he was sick too. Thought he was sick too. Who are you? What are you?" And Tolstoy echoed and taught us, this is the entire essence of life. Who are you? What are you? That's the essence of life. It's a question often triggered by a life-changing event, one that we must all ask ourselves as we realize that the world is in a meta-crisis, maybe caught in a sinister reset attempt. The answer determines our response to fixing what is wrong in the situation we are in and contributing to the healing that is needed. How we choose to engage with this meta-crisis. It's an absolute imperative. Because we share a common humanity and are inextricably linked to each other, we share a common home, the planet, a common family, our society, and a common means of subsistence, the economy. In Africa, we call this Ubuntu. I am because we are. This is going to be the briefest of introductions to story bridging. This is just to have a look at where we are at this very time. From left to right, as you look at this chart, the picture shows how we've got to the sad place we are in now. What does this mean in terms of prevalent cultural norms and consequent behaviors, and what needs fixing? So we are in a bad way, hurt, frightened, in despair. The world we live in is sick in many ways, wounded, traumatized, in severe psychic existential pain. We are, in fact, experiencing what psychologist William James referred to as our torn to pieces hood. As a family, we've become disconnected, isolated, combative. We suffer from an unbalanced, overly rational, technological mindset. Our societal norms are driven by institutions and the wealth and power holding elite. Our problems are solved by science and technology, and we address symptoms, not causes. That's to the detriment of our own human qualities and capacities. This shifting of the burden was pointed out 20 years ago by Peter Senge of Learning Organization fame. Where do we live? Our home, our habitat, our environment is damaged by irresponsible resource exploitation, irresponsible capitalism, waste, pollution. There's been a disconnect between humanity and nature. How do we survive, make a living, subsist, trade? Our means, the economy, has suffered from industrialization, mass production, commercialization, unrestrained consumerism, a continuous growth paradigm, and an ever-widening gap between the haves and the have-nots. The behavioral and cultural consequences of these trends damage our family, our home, our means are very significant. They include a focus on materialistic, extrinsic values, and as I mentioned, that technology mindset. So we need to do something about that, because we're into thinking and living that way. That's our culture. Compulsion, compassion, morality, dominance, narcissism, hate-based solutions, all of these things are on the rise. And together with that, we've seen a very disquieting development. The emergence in politics and in the business world of story that misinforms, manipulates, coerces, divides, demeans, belittles, and deceives. Fake news, brand stories that pretend that values and principles that are not practiced, downright blatant lies by political and industrial leaders. I read a book once by Scott Peck, who described evil as being based on deception. And he illustrated how fragmentation of our conscience happens collectively. That made a big impact on me. The book was called The People of the Lie. I think in many ways we now live in the world of the lie. The Massachusetts Institute of Technology has recently shown in a study that falsehood diffuses farther, faster, deeper, and more broadly than the truth in all categories of information. So no matter how compelling the argument you give to another, no matter how logical debate, protest, argument never changes another person's mind, beliefs, worldview, or standpoint. So we need a better way to connect and to influence more positively. Because we have here what Ivan Krylov called an elephant in the room, something that cannot be ignored, something that needs healing. So here are two quite powerful metaphors. Walls that separate, block, divide, hide, imprison, and bridges that reach over and connect. Walls, first of all. They've been erected because of that cultural narrative, the trend I showed you on the previous slide. These walls are at nation-state level, institutional level, organizational level, in communities, families, in our close relationships, and within ourselves, conscious and unconscious, our limiting beliefs, our cognitive biases, our mindsets or paradigms, and our worldviews. Separation and polarization between people is endemic. The regulations driving responses to COVID-19, whether you call it an epidemic, a pandemic, a plandemic, a panicdemic, or a spamdemic, however you view it, is worsening because the way people are implementing it is to use command and control and coercion. Children wearing masks are learning to distrust and avoid the other. This polarization and separation is set to continue for generations to come. Part of our recovery from this existential pain could be the adoption of story bridging. We could see it used by leaders willing to reach out and engage with sensitivity. It's an arte scienza framework for individuals, groups, organizations. This isn't one of those flash in the pan, get all fired up, then fizzle out things. It's a commitment to being part of a huge effort to bridge harmful differences, to live that Tolstoy quest. Who am I? What am I? A new way forward, perhaps. It's not a way of using storytelling to convince, persuade, entertain, impose, or tell. No. It's about deep listening, being open, connecting, sharing, finding common ground, being compassionate, and crossing over the walls. The American systems theorist Buckminster Fuller said, "You never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, you build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. So here's a slide which shows how we think about the story bridging. What is the process and what deepens our relationships during the story bridging practice? What is our way of being? So I've already said it's well known that we're hardwired to deny what doesn't fit with our own worldviews, and that story bridging requires quite a bit of sensitivity and a different approach. So the model, if you look at this chart, and it doesn't have to be linear, by the way, but broadly speaking, the horizontal axis at the bottom shows the process steps. So we go from preparation to reaching out, engaging, and so on. The vertical axis, running on the left-hand side from bottom to top, shows how the relationship develops, warms up, becomes close during the process. And the diagonal blocks show the essence of successful story bridging. So, for preparation, we start at the bottom left, and the practitioner acknowledges a separation, that there is a polarization, a split relationship. And the practitioner prepares by adopting a right mindset, by visualizing a future that brings the teller and listener together. It's a future bridge that the Native American indigenous people use to see what's going to be. That preparation includes researching the topic, researching the cultural differences of the other, researching the stories that need to be told, the sensitivities that exist, viewpoints. It also looks inside self to think about biases, prejudices, barriers that might be there. And this is getting us ready to reach out and gain that awareness and consciousness of the other. Perhaps we invoke forgiveness. It's about having a willingness to explore together, not to try and impose on the other. And such preparation requires putting on the cloak of imperfection. We don't know it all. And the sooner we realize that, the better. We are imperfect and we don't have all the answers. So in some ways, this preparation may be the longest part of the story bridging process. And it should be seen in its own right as an act of love. And this work contributes towards the change and the relationship status that follows on from here. Okay. Then comes reaching out. When we're ready, reaching out calmly, peacefully, in humility, being vulnerable with sensitivity and maturity. And we don't have time to cover this now, but maturity covers cognitive maturity, emotional maturity, social, ethical, physical embodiment, spiritual maturity. And those maturities go a long way to developing that elusive, magical quality of presence. That's not the same as charisma, but being present for the other, being tuned in, exuding compassion, coming alongside, walking with the other, being there to not see through the other, but to see the other through. Being present in a super aware way so that we find meaning and something very special in what's happening right now. The thought, the feeling, the action that's taking place as stories are told, as the connection is made. So for me, presence is when the top of head stuff and the bottom of heart stuff are completely and naturally aligned without effort. In reaching out, we use non-violent communication to focus not on the issues, but to share needs and requests with the other. to share common aspects of our personhood, because this is what helps bonding and empathy building. Okay, moving on. Engagement. It's more than just displaying empathy. Presence, of course, continues, but here we're really listening in love. Dan Siegel, the neuroscientist, talks about the other person feeling heard and feeling felt. Here's a place where compassion emerges together with wisdom. They're like two wings of the same bird, both needed. So in reaching the other, there's a deeper, transcending knowledge worth recognizing. Richard Rohr said, wisdom is knowledge deepened by love. The wise person knows more deeply by way of love than by way of argument, because the eye of the heart can see the truth of reality. So here's where we begin to move from me to we, where common ground is found. That finding of common ground is, it happens in a shared space. The Native American Cherokee Indians who had their powwow circles and used a talking stick as they conversed and shared their stories and conversations, they saw the circle itself as sacred, as a sacred place. I think that applies to bridging story as well. So the relationship moves into knowing and accepting the other, learning what influences and events and stories and narratives have shaped them. And it's a heart-mind connection that happens as common ground is found. So even if we, at the end of the engagement, disagree, we've still found common ground, and we've still accepted each other unconditionally as human beings who need acceptance and being listened to. An interesting thing here, again, is Dan Siegel has a new definition of the mind. It's not like two people with two separate brains talking to each other and remaining independent. Instead, it's a shared, emergent, self-organizing, embodied and relational process that regulates the flow of energy and information. So the mind is one thing between two people, not two separate things. And I think understanding from that perspective is integral to story bridging. So the story bridging process now approaches an even higher state, where we could think of people having mutual, unconditional, positive regard for each other, and where something beyond our ken comes into operation. There's a dynamic that's almost paranormal, where we have an interconnectedness. We're dealing with the explicit reality, what we can observe and know, and holding that up underneath is an implicate reality that we'll never fully comprehend and understand. Rupert Sheldrake talks about morphic resonance. We know things before we know them. So it's like entering a room and you know that someone's staring at you, and then later on you realize, yeah, that's right, someone has been staring at you. There's an underlying unconscious knowing that happens. It's almost like telepathy, an unconscious knowing. And there's sometimes an unconscious transmission of feelings and understandings across space and time. It becomes a collective. There's a deep sharing and a deep connection that takes place. Ilya Delio, the Catholic scholar and scientist, refers to bees and ants. So, for example, they're unable to survive in isolation, but in great numbers they act almost like the cells of a complex organism with a collective intelligence. So in story bridging, we're talking about a level of shared consciousness that transcends the boundaries of religion, culture, ethnicity, and all the other differences, and really brings us together. That's the essence of story bridging. It's an evolution towards greater unity of love and shared virtues. It's breathtaking because, you see, after all, human separation and hurt requires healing through connection. And connection is a relational process. So healing is also essentially a relational process. Just to try and illustrate that for you, there's a story that might begin to show how that story bridging process works. Told by Theodore Zeldin. In the story, we can trace a progression from separation to bridging. There's a knock-on ripple effect. So listen for these steps in the story that I'll tell, how there's a move from dislike, anger, separation, to awareness of the plight of the other, to understanding, acceptance, a silent space that's held before there comes a reaching out, an urge to act, a readiness. We then see love in action, a finding of common ground, a positive contagion, a move from individual to group involvement, and difference is transcended. And we end up with a mutual positive regard at the community level. In 1944, the mother of the poet Yevtushenko traveled from Siberia to Moscow, where she witnessed a procession of 20,000 German prisoners of war marching through the streets. The general strutted at their head, oozing contempt, determined to show that they still considered themselves superior. "The bastards smell of perfume," someone shouted. The crowd yelled its hatred. The women waved their clenched fists in anger, and the police had great difficulty in holding them back. But when the Russians saw how pitifully thin and ragged the ordinary German soldiers were, dirty, battered, completely miserable, torn to pieces, many of them hobbling on crutches, the street became silent. Suddenly, an elderly woman broke through the cordon and held out a crust of bread to one of the soldiers. Then from every side, other women copied her, giving food, cigarettes, whatever they had with them. The soldiers were no longer enemies. They were people. Story bridging happens in the business world. Here's a small example. In 2014, we worked for Greenpeace. Francesco Storocci of Enel in Italy. Enel were in the energy business. They built coal plants and sworn enemies of Greenpeace. Greenpeace claimed that Enel coal plants were killing people. And of course, Enel refuted this. There were protracted court cases, battles on many fronts. And what happened as they shared their stories and bridged their gaps is that they're now partners. And Enel Green Power has become a leading international renewable resources business. So it's possible. There's much more to the story than that, but I see we're starting to run out of time. So let's move on. Bereket in Turkey, one of the Anatolian tigers, have a model of benevolent leadership. And that includes a balanced approach to spiritual depth, ethical sensitivity, positive engagement, and a community responsiveness that's very endearing. And they've done marvelous stuff in their community. They've bridged to the community, they've bridged to their employees, they've bridged to competitors, they've bridged to suppliers in different ways. And they've made lots of money in the process. So it's possible, it can happen. So story bridging, it's about a lot more than just telling stories, and it's about connecting people, and it reflects in the lives of those who reach out and those who accept it. And it's a way of bringing unity and forgiving and common ground into this highly polarized world we live in. It's both desirable and it's possible. And perhaps in another talk we might explore further how the process of story bridging goes beyond and what it's characterized by. So, for example, it's not about telling, it's about deep listening. It's not about parent-child, it's about adult-adult. It's not about certainty, because being certain, as Socrates said, can be uncomfortable. And being uncertain, rather being certain, is actually being ridiculous, because we're not perfect, we don't know everything. So it's not about certainty, it's about being imperfect, being open. Not about a part-time practice, it's a pervasive full-time practice. It's not about impatience and weariness, it's about positive, unconditional regard. It's not only about the ordinary and the mundane, but it's also about the unusual, the unconventional, and the beyond normal. It's not just about a destination or result, it's about a journey together, a joint discovery. It's not only about what separates and divides, but what brings shared understanding, hope, and common ground. It's not only about giving, but also about receiving, giving and receiving. Not about me, but about we. Not only about material things and cognitive things, but about spiritual things and hard things. It's about attending, processing, expecting, finding. Also about having a beginner's mind and being surprised and found by the other. It's more than a one-way shift of viewpoint. It's a two-way shift of viewpoints within self and in the relationship. So that was a very, very sketchy, quick introduction to story bridging. Thank you. I apologize for cramming so much into such a short space of time and perhaps not allowing you enough time to digest. But please feel free to be in touch with me by email if you want any further explanation. Thank you once again.
Graham, thank you so much. It was a wonderful talk, and I don't really honestly know what I enjoyed more, the model you gave, which is really practical, and the step-by-step follow through to a more bridging leadership and bridging approach, or the stories you told and how much of the culture and the cultural things you've mentioned. I really am grateful for such a deep analysis. Thank you so much.
Oh, an absolute pleasure. I was just so worried about trying to cram too much into too short a space of time. But if it made some sense, and if people use some aspects of it, I'd be absolutely delighted, Archie.
For me, it really makes a lot of sense, and I hope that our audience on the conference will also feel this way. Let me ask you a couple of questions, and one obligatory question that I will pose to every speaker. So what I was thinking about during my talk was, how can a person leading a team in the business position himself or herself better to use the kind of story bridging technologies and knowledge to maybe solve a more down-to-earth conflict. For example, we have a lot of situations where departments are quarreling because they have different kinds of goals, and a goal of one department being achieved is basically a failure of another department. Like KPI systems are bad. So is there a way we can story bridge these kinds of situations? And maybe are there some clues for leaders in these kinds of, down-to-earth business problems?
Absolutely. I think, look, silos in organizations have been around for as long as organizations have been around. So the finance people, for example, will think that the sales people get all the perks and socialize and don't really earn the big commissions that they get paid. And the sales people might think that the finance people are only interested in credit outstandings and payments and don't really understand the customers and so on. I think the connecting, the crossing over those silos comes with a deep aspect of story bridging is listening. And you can do that by visiting each other and putting yourself in the other department's shoes for a day or two, have little exchanges, speak to each other, listen to each other. People love being listened to, they love being heard, they love being acknowledged. And that begins the bridging process. And then it's following those steps to get that movement from me to we, from us to us together. Not we and them, but us.
Graham, thank you. That was a wonderful reply. And let me ask you one more question I was thinking about. You've described perfectly a world we've created ourselves with not so great decisions. And to wrap up, I would love to hear your opinion about what kinds of traits can we invest in developing today as humans that can really help us in the future create a more bridged world and a great place to live in.
I think my answer is going to sound quite counterintuitive to many, and not always easy to grasp as a hard-nosed business leader. And sometimes we shouldn't talk about hard and soft. We should talk about hard and harder. So I think the things that are really going to count in future are things like compassion. It's the ultimate expression of freedom is being compassionate, reaching out to another, of embracing, because we're all connected, like it or not. We breathe the same air, we belong on the same planet, we affect each other deeply, whether we know it and acknowledge it or not. Another aspect, I think, is being vulnerable, of being imperfect. It's the first step in the Alcoholics Anonymous 12 steps, to acknowledge I'm here because I couldn't do it on my own. I need help. I'm not perfect. The minute we can say that, we're authentic, we're vulnerable, we're open, we're not in charge, we're not too certain, we're not too proud. And those are spiritual qualities, not religious qualities, but spiritual qualities that are desperately needed in today's world. And people relate to them. Compassion is a very endearing leadership quality. People follow that. They're attracted to it. They swarm around it. So it's a power thing too, compassion. It's not soft. And I think those are the things that count, because with those qualities, people then become better listeners automatically. And for me, storytelling is about listening, and only afterwards about telling.
Lovely. Thank you so much. What a beautiful explanation, and it really makes up for a better human being. Graham, one last question that
Yes.
I want to ask to all our guests at this conference. The world we are living in is a world of leadership, and our goal today and for all the 5 days is to storyfy the leadership. So I want you to think about it and continue the phrase I made up. If there is one thing a story can teach a leader, that one thing is.
Wow, that's a wonderful question. Humility, that true stories don't have to be explained and interpreted, that to allow an adult to adult acceptance of the story is simply to tell the story and let the listener analyze it, learn from it, gain their own insights, decide their own actions.
Lovely. Thank you so much. What a beautiful answer. Graham, it was an amazing honor to host you, and I really loved listening to your talk. I hope you guys also enjoyed it, and you will be looking for opportunities to story bridge the world around you. Graham, thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, Arjun. And I hope we stay in contact. Thank you.
We will.